Hello and welcome back to Westferry Times. I'm your host, Emily Carter. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something pretty significant that's developing the UK's proposal for asylum return hubs abroad. Think of this as, well, your shortcut to getting up to speed on what this is all about. And with us to help unpack it all is Dr. James Thornton. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Migration Policy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And just a quick note to say thank you for watching Westferry Times, everyone. Right, so our mission today is to really get our heads around these return hubs. What are they? How are they different from, say, other plans we've heard about? What are the challenges, the hurdles, and, what does it mean in the bigger picture? Let's dig in. So maybe let's start right there. What exactly are these proposed return hubs, and what's the thinking behind them?
Okay. So essentially, the idea is to set up facilities in other countries, third countries, and these places would house people whose asylum claims here in the UK have actually been refused. The main logic, or the rationale from the government, seems to be, well, twofold, really. First, to have a place to detain people while they sort out the arrangements to return them to their home countries, speeding up removals. And second, they hope it acts as a deterrent, discouraging people from attempting irregular migration routes to the UK.
Okay, so this is specifically after someone's claim has been rejected. How does that make it different from the Rwanda plan? Because that got a lot of headlines.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction to make. The Rwanda plan, that was about sending asylum seekers to Rwanda for their entire claim to be processed there. It didn't matter if their claim was ultimately successful or not. The processing happened in Rwanda. These return hubs, though, are different. They're only for people whose claims have already been assessed and rejected by the UK system. So it's focused purely on managing departure post-rejection, not outsourcing the actual asylum decision-making process itself.
Right. Okay, that clarifies the focus. Now, we heard early on that Albania declined to host such a hub. How significant was that refusal for the UK's plans?
Well, Albania pulling back was definitely a setback. They were seen as a potential key partner, partly because of its geography and previous cooperation on migration. Their refusal really underscores the diplomatic difficulties here. We understand the UK is talking to other countries. Serbia, North Macedonia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina have been mentioned. But getting agreements there involves navigating, well, a whole different set of diplomatic issues, not to mention the legal and human rights angles that inevitably come up.
And on that international point, are there other countries doing similar things? Are there precedents we can look at?
Yes, there are some parallels, though maybe not exact matches. The EU itself has been, let's say, exploring similar concepts for a while now, externalizing parts of migration management. Italy, for instance, has that agreement with Albania to process some migrants there, although that's faced its own legal challenges. And the European Commission has even floated the idea of legislation for return hubs outside the EU. But all these examples, they raise the same big questions about international law, about human rights standards, something a lot of places are wrestling with.
Which leads us neatly into, well, those very concerns. What are the main legal and human rights issues being flagged with these UK return hub proposals?
The biggest one, fundamentally, is the principle of non-refoulement.
Right.
That's the absolute core of international refugee law. You cannot send someone back to a place where they face serious threats, persecution, torture, real harm, even if their UK claim failed, housing them in a third country before potentially sending them back to their origin country.
Well, it raises flags about whether that onward return might still put them at risk.
And then there are worries about the actual conditions inside these hubs. Things like, access to lawyers, how transparent the whole process is, are basic rights being upheld. The EU's Agency for Fundamental Rights has warned pretty strongly against creating what they called rights-free zones. Any facility has to follow fundamental rights laws.
So with these pretty significant legal and rights concerns, how could they actually impact the UK's ability to get this plan off the ground?
They create some real hurdles. First, you could see legal challenges, right here in the UK, or maybe even in the host country, if one is found. Second, it just makes finding a willing partner country much harder. Potential hosts will likely be very cautious about getting involved in something that could bring human rights controversies. Complying with international standards isn't just about the law, it's also about reputation, avoiding breaches of obligations the UK has signed up to.
Okay, let's bring it back home then. What's the reaction been like here in the UK, politically and among the public?
It's been very mixed, really mirroring the wider, often quite polarized debates we have about immigration and asylum policy in general. On one side, you have people who see it as a necessary measure. to tackle irregular migration, strengthen border control, maybe ease pressure on the UK system.
Hmm.
But then on the other side, there's strong criticism. Arguments that it's basically the UK trying to shift its responsibilities elsewhere, potentially compromising human rights in the process. And politically, you see that split too. Different parties, different viewpoints within parties hold really contrasting views on whether this is effective or ethical. It touches on deep disagreements about refuge and border management.
And looking forward, any sense of how this policy might evolve? What are the next steps potentially?
Well, its future really hangs on a couple of big things. First and foremost, can the government actually secure an agreement with a third country? That's the immediate practical hurdle. And second, how are these legal and ethical questions going to be handled? Will there be challenges? Will changes be made to address concerns? That's crucial. We should probably also watch what happens in the EU. Their discussions, any legislation they might bring forward could influence things. And of course, the views of international bodies, human rights groups, they all play a part in shaping how this develops.
Taking a step back for the bigger picture then, what are the wider implications here for how countries generally deal with asylum and migration internationally?
I think this proposal fits into a broader pattern, a trend we're seeing from some countries towards what's called externalization, trying to manage migration flows, asylum processes outside their own borders.
Right.
And this trend, it really forces us to ask some fundamental questions about international cooperation on refugee protection, about responsibility sharing. There's a definite concern that approaches like this could weaken the global system that's meant to protect refugees, maybe even erode the right to seek asylum itself. It really highlights the need for ongoing international conversation, making sure any new measures align with, basic humanitarian principles and legal duties.
This has been incredibly insightful, really helping to clarify such a complex and, frankly, contentious issue. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this.
It's my pleasure. It's certainly a topic that requires careful thought and ongoing scrutiny.
Absolutely. So that wraps up our deep dive for today. We've looked at the UK's return HUD proposal, the diplomatic hurdles, those critical legal and ethical points, and the wider international context. Hopefully this gives you a much clearer understanding of where things stand with this developing policy. It's definitely one to keep an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us here on Westferry Times. And if you found this useful, please do subscribe to the Westferry Times channel for more deep dives like this one. Goodbye for now.